Good afternoon and welcome to JMH's monthly webinar. This month we are going to be focusing on building a marketing and recruitment ecosystem. We look forward to sharing all of this information with you. John Horn from JMH Consulting will be the presenter for this webinar. He is the president of our consulting firm and also the senior marketing consultant. John brings to our firm a very deep understanding of how to conduct online marketing and has helped to build and provide strategy for a number of universities across the country and a few in Canada as well. Before I begin, a few housekeeping comments. Just want to let you know if you have questions throughout this webinar, we will be stopping at a couple of different places and give you the opportunity to ask that question. Now, I am going to ask that you fill out the question. You'll notice in your GoToMeeting area, there's an area in which you can type in questions. If you can go ahead and type those questions in, as I said, we'll be stopping intermittently. I will read over those and have the chance to share answers, ask John, and be able to address them. If we don't get a chance to answer your question during the webinar, because we do have a full crowd today, I promise we will follow up within a week or so. And for those of you who will be at the upcoming UPSIA annual conference, also feel free to stop by and talk with us there. I will be presenting at that conference and will also be exhibiting at that conference, which also is a nice transition to my name, and that is I am Nicole Forschler Horn. I'm Vice President of JMH Consulting, and I'll be your moderator today. John, I want to go ahead and turn it over to you, although I should say one other thing. If for some reason you have to leave early or after this webinar you think to yourself, gosh, I really need to show this webinar to 3 other people, we will be sending out the recording of the webinar in our email follow-up to you. So take heart. If for some reason you have to leave early, you will have access to the complete webinar. Okay, well, John, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you guys all for attending today. You know, the concept of an ecosystem is something we've been thinking about for a couple of years now, and I should take a moment as we begin to thank Jeff Ropey at the University of Oklahoma and Sarah McDonald from James Madison University for their help in creating and delivering some earlier versions of this presentation at conferences. It's certainly an evolutioning, it's an evolving thinking process around this, around conceptualizing the way that marketing and recruiting elements work in relationship to how prospective students choose to engage with us. And essentially, what we've found over time is that traditional metaphors have become less useful for us as the complexity of marketing and recruiting processes and the technologies have evolved and continue to evolve. So this presentation kind of represents our current way of thinking about designing such systems, but I want to take care to note that even that is continuing to evolve. And every time I talk on this subject or relate to the ecosystem or sit down and think about it, I tend to come up with some new aspect, a new component of the metaphor, or a new way to approach it. So I hope that you'll find this useful as we go through. As Nicole said, we'll be recording this and it'll be available to you afterward. But really my goal today is pretty simple. I want to convince you of 3 things. First, that the ecosystem metaphor is a more useful metaphor than talking about a funnel in conceptualizing and designing recruiting systems. Second, that by visualizing your own ecosystem as it exists today, you can better understand how your marketing and recruiting efforts work together and more easily identify the weaknesses and the opportunities for improvements in those systems. So we'll take a look at what an example of what a mature ecosystem diagram might look like. And then third, that while the ecosystem may be complex, measuring it doesn't have to be. You only need to regularly monitor a few simple metrics to help identify for yourself when you need to dig into the more complex data. So we'll talk a little bit about measuring the ecosystem and what to do as you're gathering all of this just growing sets of data that we all seem to be bombarded with today. But I thought a good place for us to begin is by thinking just a little bit about the ecosystem in general, the ecosystem concept. Because obviously this is a metaphor that we're using to help us wrap our minds around a system that's fairly complex. And so what I thought we would do is, to make this a little bit engaging, you should all have a chat window in your GoToWebinar system. And in that chat window, I'd like to ask a few of you to just type in some of the characteristics or phrases or concepts that you might associate with a traditional ecosystem. So when you see an ecosystem, such as the lovely one sitting in front of you, what kinds of terms come to your mind? And I'll give you just a couple minutes to think about that. You can type that right into the chat window. I see interdependencies. I see beneficial. Holistic, important, balance, useful. I see complex, interconnected. That's great. Necessary. Wonderful. Exactly right. I mean, some of the things that come to my mind, take a look here. First, complex interrelationships between parts, right? There are sometimes even hard to pin down all of the ways in which the various components within an ecosystem might interrelate or might be interdependent. Second, that ecosystems often require both competition and cooperation to stay in balance. I heard a fantastic TED Talk recently about a gentleman talking about the reintroduction of wolves into, I think it was Yellowstone Park out west, and the unimaginable impact that simply reintroducing a handful of wolves really into that ecosystem had, even changing the flow of rivers within the landscape. And you might say, how would wolves change the flow of rivers? And I would say, well, you have to watch the TED Talk, and he explains it. But I will tell you, it has to do with the reduction of other species as the wolves as predators were introduced into the ecosystem, and the reduction in other species affects the foliage in the area, which in turn affects erosion, which in turn affects the flow of rivers. So there's a really interesting sort of effect of, again, going back to the interrelation between parts and the effect of that competition for food sources and cooperation within the ecosystems. It's also ecosystems or communities in which every member has a role. The ecosystems tend to find that balance point where all of the different components within the system are in sync. Next, not all ecosystems are fragile, but we hear a great deal of talk about external factors, which, including humanity and our influence on various ecological ecosystems, and that's a real factor, and I think we'll see that how it plays into the metaphor that we're going to talk about today. And then lastly, that the balance can be upset if a part is removed. Some parts are much less necessary than others, but that's always a thought process that I have about ecosystems, is that they really can be, in some cases, fragile in the way that they maintain balance. Now, if we take a moment and look at these phrases, as well as the ones that you guys submitted, I want to convince you that many of these terms could be equally applied to our marketing and recruiting systems today, and that this metaphor is going to be a useful one as we move forward. So My first point, or the first area that I want to discuss, is that the fact that both the ecosystem and the funnel metaphor are both useful. And let me be clear that I understand, as with all metaphors, that both of these are simply concepts to help us to better understand and make decisions. But I'm going to suggest that the concept of a funnel is less useful today, and probably has been for a while, because it doesn't effectively capture the way that students actually behave, and particularly adult students that I assume many of you are working with. Now, traditional undergraduate students, just because of the timing of their application process, probably tend to behave a bit more linearly. In other words, there's a certain time of year when they usually do campus visits. There's a certain time of year when they're usually applying. So there's a more anticipatory kind of process that they're going to go through. But when we start talking about adult students, graduate programs, certificate programs, degree completion programs, those adult students behave very differently from the undergraduate students, and frankly, their behavior is much more complex and much more unpredictable in the ways that they're going to engage with us. And I think that we need a metaphor and a system of conceptualizing their behavior that's different from the traditional funnel. Now, let's start with the funnel. Let's look at that. We usually talk about the process of sales or of recruiting in our industry as this sort of a funnel. And you may be familiar with the traditional AIDA model: awareness, interest, desire, and action. I changed that up a little bit in the way that I talk about it, in that I talk about awareness and interest. So awareness is then just becoming aware that you have a program available, either through a billboard or some sort of online ad. Interest might be visiting your website or reading a piece of print collateral that you're distributing. So they're showing some interest, but they haven't yet engaged with you, which would be the next step, which is engagement. This could be someone calling you, submitting an email to a recruiter or a program representative. It could be someone coming to an information session about your program, but they are now engaged with you in thinking about your program. And then, of course, the last piece is conversion, which can be very simple for more transactional courses and programs, or can be fairly complex in the case of applications and collecting, historical transcripts and such. Now, in this idea of this funnel, people are dropping off at each stage as they move down the funnel, but a few, we hope, eventually make it all the way down to the bottom. And the concept of a funnel, I think, is very useful in discussing the number of people in each of these stages, but I think it's dangerous when used to conceptualize the way in which we engage prospects for two reasons. One, it assumes that we know how and where students begin their exploration. But students are coming into our programs in lots of different ways. They're finding out about us in different ways. They may find out about us months ago and not do anything about it, so that awareness might be very much disconnected from the point at which they do engage. And two, I think there's a misconception that prospects progress linearly through this funnel from top to bottom. No, I don't necessarily believe that any of us actually believe that every single prospective student moves through these four stages, but that's what the metaphor of a funnel suggests. And I think that working off of that conception constrains the way that we think about designing our systems and the way that we allow for or even encourage prospective students to engage with us, because our model of a funnel suggests that people move down through these stages. But in reality, I think we need to think about them moving up and down through these stages, and even horizontally within this framework. People may hover in a particular stage for a while and generate or exhibit interest in several different ways. In truth, I think that a more accurate visualization of the process through which many students move would be this. So yes, I'm going to suggest that the marketing and recruiting functions are probably more like Candyland than a traditional funnel. Now you can think of this colored trail as the progress from awareness to interest to engagement to conversion. You can think of the early squares as kind of awareness marketing, maybe display ads, billboards, things like that. Midway through, you're getting into the interest area where maybe they're visiting your website and such. As you get toward the top, this is where they're engaged in conversations with your recruiters or program representatives. Maybe they're attending info sessions. And then hopefully, finally, they make it to the Candy Castle at the very top. But there are some additional parallels between this game and the recruiting process. If you, like me, played this with yourself, perhaps, or with your own children, you'll remember that sometimes you get within a few spaces of the end, and suddenly you draw a card that sets you back tremendously, and then you're progressing through those steps again to get back to the end. Or maybe the time when you drew the candy card on your very first draw and you jumped way ahead and bypassed a whole section of the game. So similar things, I think, happen as we recruit students. For example, sometimes students jump from one stage to another very quickly, right? They might take the Rainbow Bridge and bypass an entire section of interactions that we might expect that prospective students would go through. They might also get stuck in certain places, stuck in the mud, and where they're not making decisions. They're in analysis paralysis. They're trying to decide whether this program is right, and they're just not taking those steps. And they might hover there for weeks or even months at a time, just trying to wait for the right timing, the right time for their financials, or some other external factor in their lives to work itself out. We also have instances where students behave, or prospective students behave, unpredictably. They might jump ahead. They might move backwards. You might have someone who is ready to enroll. Perhaps they've even applied and been accepted into a program, and suddenly some life event that might even be outside of their control sets them back to the beginning. I had someone who was in an accident, like a biking accident, and after she had enrolled about a week into the program and had to go all the way back and rethink about when she could restart this program. So people are really moving up and down and left and right through all types of different ways of potentially engaging with us. In fact, this might represent the way a player in this game might move from place to place through the stages of the game. So as you can see, some of the jumps are short, some are long, some are unpredictable, and it's not consistent progress. Jeff Roby, in fact, told me about earlier today, I was talking from University of Oklahoma, that he's been talking with a particular prospective student for 4 years. This person is in the military, and every time he gets ready to enroll in this degree program, he keeps getting deployed. It's happened 2 or 3 times. And then when he comes back from his deployment, he restarts the conversation. So, this happens, and this is a reality. And I think that we can start to conceptualize and design our systems using this sort of metaphor of an ecosystem that acknowledge this behavior, so we can engage with the students in the ways that they actually behave, rather than working off of what are potentially inaccurate assumptions. So, assuming I've convinced you that the ecosystem could be a useful metaphor, let's talk about what that looks like. So I would say to you, think about the ways in which your potential students might hear about your program. And think about what happens to those people after they encounter that first billboard, or that first postcard, or that first whatever it might be. We think about the ways in which they interact, and how some interactions lead to others. So what I'll start us with is this. I think it's helpful, it is helpful to think about these various components in the system in terms of stages of interaction, similar to a marketing funnel. So we've got here, I've got 5 stages. You might decide to break yours up a little bit differently. This is kind of the way that I've come to think about it. There's an awareness stage where I'm not really expecting people to take any significant action, but I want to make sure that they know we're here when they're ready to take that action. Direct response marketing are techniques that we use to try to get people to engage right then. So an example would be paid search marketing. If someone is out doing a search for a program like yours and you're running paid search ads, your hope is that they click on that ad, come to your website, and take those next steps. Okay, so you're hoping that they're going to respond. Postcard marketing might be another type of direct response. So you're hoping someone gets that postcard and then does something with it, visits your website or calls you, something like that. Lead generation, to me, that's the process of actually getting somebody's information, of actually learning who a person is that is interested in a particular program. And online, a lot of lead generation takes place through inquiry forms, and sometimes through options to engage in a live chat. But it's only a lead, to me, if we know who that person is and we can continue the conversation with them. So there's methodologies around that. And then remarketing is our process of talking back to people who have already expressed interest and we know who they are. So once we've captured an inquiry or a lead or someone who says, gosh, yeah, I'm really thinking about this program, we can continue not only through phone calls and conversations or email exchanges with that person, but even through some other methods of continuing to show them ads, perhaps even more targeted ads, that acknowledge the fact that this person is interested in this program and continue to kind of encourage them to consider it and maybe take that next step. And then the last stage here being recruiting, which is where we're actively engaging with our leads to try to help them work through the financial aid process, the admissions process, or the enrollment process. So if we think about these layers, we could then populate these layers with some components that we might use to engage with students. So in this case, I've simply dropped in a number of different techniques into each of these different layers, the things that might serve as a representative sample of the types of marketing and recruiting functions that you might be engaged in. Then from here, we can then take the next step of saying, okay, well, how do these elements interact with each other? Because these are not freestanding elements. In fact, that's one of my probably biggest pet peeves in people who think about marketing elements as being independent. When you're running, for example, paid search ads, you want to be thinking about, well, how does the other marketing that I'm doing, perhaps this awareness marketing, how does that influence my paid search ads? If I'm maxing out, for example, my paid search budget, but then suddenly I'm going to launch a new traditional awareness marketing campaign, as you can see here, these awareness campaigns, a lot of the marketing that you do is actually going to drive people to search engines. Even though the marketing you put out there might have your website address on it, let's say somebody drives by a billboard or sees some other type, an ad in a magazine or something like that, they may type your website in directly, but there's also a good chance that all they're going to remember is that such and such a university or college has such and such a program. So they may go to a search engine and try to search on you. Now, you may come up. They may not remember even which university it was. They may do a generalized search. But having that paid search budget, going back to my original point, if I'm increasing my awareness marketing, I may also want to increase my paid search budget to accommodate the increase of searches that may happen as a result of that traditional awareness marketing or social media marketing that I'm beginning to do. So there's an interrelationship between these. If we go one step further, we can also see that both the awareness and the direct response marketing are feeding down into the lead generation. In fact, that's often the goal of awareness and direct response marketing, is to try to generate leads, either through inbound phone calls where someone can, can directly engage with that person, or by driving those individuals to your website or to landing pages where hopefully they're going to fill out an inquiry form or join a mailing list or sign up for an information session, something like that. So when we run paid ads or display ads or work on our search engine optimization or do some sort of direct response marketing, we're really trying to get those people down to this lead stage. And then we can go even further and say, that lead stage can then, once we have those leads captured, we can think about remarketing to people. Now, you might not think about email marketing or making phone calls as remarketing, but there are automated call systems. We're doing more and more work around automated email drip campaigns where someone joins a mailing list, and then over the next 6 months, they get a progressive set of emails that maybe come at particular times that we've identified. There's also a growing range of retargeting and remarketing capabilities on Facebook and display marketing. A lot of people don't know, for example, you can take your email marketing list out of a CRM system or an email marketing system. You can upload those into Facebook, and Facebook will try to match up emails. You can also do this with phone numbers with members in the Facebook network. And if they find a match, you can then create a target audience. Let's say you had 5,000 people on an email marketing list. You can then generate, maybe half of those have matches in Facebook on their email address. Well, there's 2,500 people that were on your email marketing list that you can now show ads to in Facebook. So it's another way of using your mailing list that you're probably putting a lot of energy into building, but it's doing it through Facebook, where you don't have to worry so much about overwhelming people with too many emails within a certain period of time. So there's all of these ways with this remarketing, but notice some of the remarketing actually drives people back up. So people see an ad, a display ad, because of remarketing. It might then take them to a landing page where, again, they can fill out an inquiry form or contact you via a phone number, try to engage with you. So some of this CRM work that we do and the remarketing actually feeds some of those higher stages. And then lastly, a lot of this work, our ultimate goal is to get people down into this recruiting section where we can be talking and emailing with them on an individualized basis, have them attend information sessions. We often find there's no better indicator of the seriousness of a prospective candidate than their attendance at an information session, and then ultimately to get them engaged in the enrollment or the application process for the program. So this is essentially an example of a mature student recruitment ecosystem. It looks a little overwhelming and maybe a bit hard to digest, but this is the end goal, to create this system and to understand the interrelationships between these various pieces. And unlike in a funnel metaphor, we expect prospective students to move up and down between these stages. And we develop strategies to engage students, not only to simply push them downward, but to recapture them when they move back up to a higher stage and bring them back into the conversation. Okay. Now, to be clear, this is not the ecosystem. I'm not suggesting that this is the model that you should use. Not all of this is necessary, but all of this can be important. There are many other pieces that could be added into this diagram. And we at JMH, we spend a lot of time helping schools to determine what makes sense, what the various components of their ecosystem should look like, and then helping them to set up the appropriate components as well. Here's another example of an ecosystem. This is a much simpler ecosystem. We don't have any or what I call organic social media. We don't have any landing pages here. We're not doing remarketing on Facebook. We're not doing email drip campaigns. This is a perfectly fine ecosystem, and this may be more representative of what works for your program. So the important thing here is that is for for you and for each of us to understand our ecosystems so that we can identify weaknesses and opportunities within them. So this is a good point, Nicole, that I want to stop and see if we have any questions from attendees.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. We do.
Oh, you might be on mute.
I think I am not. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
Great. Sorry about that. There's a delay in the muting process. We don't have too many questions, but we do have one that I think that you started to address a little bit, John, when you said that whenever we construct an ecosystem, there is kind of a customized approach depending on the brand and the school and, of course, resources. But someone did ask, given that you can add and subtract things from an ecosystem, and you're making a sweeping generalization here, what do you see as the handful of most critical pieces to building an ecosystem? Kind of what do you absolutely need, or else it really won't function very well? Your ecosystem will be more of a desert.
Sure, that's a great question. And in addressing that, I'm actually going to jump back to our the first diagram that I was using. You know, I'll answer it maybe this way. The things that I often see missing from people's ecosystems that I think are really important, because I think everyone kind of gets the idea that there should be some awareness marketing and even some direct response. I mean, we've been doing that for years. What I still see as lacking is an intentionality around the lead generation and the remarketing stages. So obviously everyone's going to have a website for programs that they're marketing, but what I don't see on those websites often are multiple ways for prospective students to engage. So someone might be visiting your website who is far down the decision process, and they're looking for a contact us form so they can ask a very specific question. Someone else might be visiting your website early in their decision process. They've just seen some ad on Facebook and clicked over. They don't have a particular question. They just want to get some basic information about your program. And maybe the idea of having a recruiter calling them at that point is distasteful to them. They just want to be able to kind of anonymously sign up for a mailing list and get a little bit of information about your program. So to me, one of the really critical things is on your website, which you can even just see visually from this diagram, serves as kind of the hub for a lot of the other pieces to make sure that that website is engaging for people at several different stages of their decision cycle and offers those opportunities. And the other thing that I would probably point to as being really critical is some kind of a CRM system. Doesn't have to be incredibly fancy, but you've got to have some place of capturing the leads so that you can create some institutional knowledge around how many leads are coming in, what happens to those leads, and allow yourself to engage with them over time and not rely on, I mean, I've seen people using everything from just, you know, keeping filing emails away in their in folders in their inbox to Excel spreadsheets, but none of those contribute to the institutional knowledge, and all of those are very limiting in some way. So having a good CRM system with some smart workflows to help people engage with those prospects in the right ways, those would probably be the things I would point to.
One other question that was included is if you could speak a little bit to remarketing and how remarketing, this question specifically asked about perfect audience as part of the ecosystem.
Sure. Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with Perfect Audience, that is a remarketing platform in which you can remarket both on display, many websites through display ads, also on Facebook. A lot of people are using it for Facebook remarketing. There are many others. AdRoll is a competitor to Perfect Audience. You can now even do remarketing directly through the Facebook Power Editor. But I'll just speak in general about remarketing, and we've used Perfect Audience quite a bit. It is amazingly efficient. We are finding lower, the volume isn't high because you're only marketing to people who've previously visited your site, but we are finding conversion rates are incredibly high for turning those people into leads and advancing the conversation with existing leads. And we also find that the cost for doing it is really nominal. I mean, minimal. It might cost where normally we might expect a lead to cost anywhere from $30, $40 up to maybe $100 or more in marketing for each lead. We're seeing costs for remarketing in the $10 to $15 range on average. So it's a really good value for the money.
And John, there was one other question that I think I can go ahead and answer and let you take a moment to take a drink. And someone asked about CRMs and any CRMs that we recommend. At JMH, we've used a variety of CRMs. Our current favorite is probably Salesforce. For the one easy reason is they give a wonderful discount to higher education institutions, to the nonprofit higher education institutions. And they actually give 20 free licenses to each university. So the value in that, when you're weighing it to the capability of Salesforce, is pretty great. We've found IntelliWorks to also, which is now part of Hobson's, to be a pretty robust CRM that has a pretty fantastic email component that does wonderful drip campaigns. Those are the top two, but if you're in a place where you're like, we need something very basic, very simple, we have used in the past Zoho as just a way to capture information, and I think that is actually a free system. If not free, it's very, very, very inexpensive. The downside of that is you get much more limited capability, but it's still better than an Excel spreadsheet. So those are the ones that we have worked with and liked, particularly Salesforce and IntelliWorks. But look to see where you want to find value and what you need. But I think as you're looking, one thing that would be important is we always like to look at email capability as well. And those are all the...
A couple of comments, Nicole. It's 10 free licenses, not 20.
Oh, sorry. I'm overselling them.
That's okay. And I always like to note to people that Salesforce doesn't come with an integrated email marketing system, but there are a number of add-ons that allow you to extend its capabilities in that direction. That was something I found surprising when we first started working with them. I thought, why would a CRM company as large as Salesforce not just have email marketing built in? But in fact, they form partnerships with a number of email marketing firms for that capability.
Okay. Well, I'll let you continue, especially given the time that we've got left.
Great. So the last question that I wanted to address is how to measure success in such a complex system. So when we're thinking about this ecosystem, it's a bit overwhelming thinking about measuring all of those different elements. And in fact, there are dozens and dozens of metrics now, as it feels like the entire world has been talking about data-driven marketing and data-driven management for years now. To effectively measure, though, an ecosystem, we need to think about a simpler model. We have to focus on data that's going to be strategic and not just the data that we can track. And in fact, I think it's helpful to actually go back to the funnel metaphor when we're thinking about how to measure and track effectiveness. So we might think about, at each of these stages of this funnel, we can think about metrics that we could potentially track. Number of impressions on our web, or number of impressions for ads, website visits, how many inquiries or leads we're generating, how many applications, if it's a degree program, how many applications are you getting, and then ultimately, how many enrollments sort of fall out of the bottom of this funnel. But again, even at these layers, it's hard to kind of think about, well, there could be lots of things. You could track phone calls. You could track, any number of different metrics here. So this is the way that we typically approach it. I like to differentiate between strategic and operational data. And in our industry, the ultimate goal for recruiting is almost always enrollment goals. It's the quantity of enrollees that we can get into our programs. That's usually paired with maybe a marketing budget, our top KPI. Here are some of the strategic KPIs that we would track kind of coming out of that. So if enrollments are our ultimate goal, the things that I want to know leading up to those enrollments are, well, how many leads am I getting? And I want to quantify this. This is where a CRM system can help. I also want to know website visits. Now, that's not an end-all, be-all number of visitors to your website, but we have found over years in working with many universities that you can generally identify a fairly consistent ratio between each of these three metrics. So there's a ratio of leads to enrollment. It might be 10 to 1. For every 10 leads you get 1 enrollment. It might be 20 to 1. We find with many degree programs, it's closer to 20 to 1. With a lot of certificates, it's around 10 to 1. It's probably even higher than that for lower dollar personal enrichment classes. But you can find your own ratio, and then you can measure that as the health of your marketing. And we also have found that there is a ratio of website visits to leads. And that doesn't mean that all of your leads are coming from your website visits. In fact, those leads might come from phone calls and other sources. So we don't call it a conversion rate because that's not actually what we're measuring. What we're measuring is the ratios of these two different metrics. And again, we find that these ratios tend to hold fairly steady. And we find that improving our marketing efforts tends to improve these ratios. Or improving our recruiting process tends to improve these ratios. So these are things that we measure. And then, of course, we also have to pay attention to the money. So the number of leads you get is only relevant in respect to how much you had to spend on marketing and efforts to generate those leads. So we look at what is our average cost per lead, and we also, again, going back to those website visits, because that's one of the sort of few metrics you have up at that interest stage. We look at the cost per visit. So how many visits did I get? Compared to how much am I putting out in direct marketing dollars. And these are 7 really good metrics that you can calculate very easily. In fact, you really only need 4 pieces of information. How much was spent, how many website visitors did you get, how many leads did you get, and how many enrollments did you get. And you can calculate all 7 of these metrics. And then everything else, to me, is operational data. I won't say everything, but the majority of everything else, this is what I call operational data. And I use these 7 metrics to guide me in identifying what operational data I should pay attention to. Okay. So as a quick example, and then we'll wrap up, I might say I'm looking to generate $500,000 in revenue for this program. If I know that my average income per student is $5,000, I know I need 100 students to get to that revenue goal. And if I know I need 100 students, I might know because of my ratios that I probably need 2,000 leads, right, to get to the 100 students. So then if I have a $50,000 marketing budget, I can only spend a certain amount per lead. I think I've done that math wrong. But you get the idea here that we can kind of build this up backwards so that we can have a clear understanding of how much money we can spend relative to each visitor our website gets, relative to each lead, and relative to each student that I'm bringing in. And we track these. We just use a simple Excel spreadsheet where we aggregate this data on a monthly basis, and we generate these types of visual charts showing us our revenue progress toward our goal, how we're doing year over year. We look at number of enrollees. We look at the quantity of leads, which you can see in the bottom right hand. In some cases, we're also looking at expenses. And we look at those ratios. So you can see here in these charts, we're seeing how the ratio of visits to leads and leads to students is changing over time and how it relates to what our goal is and we also like to just drop that average line on there. So this is an example of a data table. This isn't any particular school or program, so I'm not giving anything away. But what you can see here are these exact metrics. There's a very few number of key metrics that we pull into this, because a lot of this is calculated. The visit to lead, the lead to student, cost per lead, cost per student. Those are all calculations that we look at this each month, and this helps us to understand if our programs and our ecosystem are healthy at that point. So I'll wrap up with just a handful of quick action items, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. I know we're running close to the end here. What I would recommend that you do coming out of this, going back, if you think this is a good idea and you like the idea of the ecosystem, map your ecosystem. You can do this on paper. You can do it in Visio, as I do. You can even do it on PowerPoint with boxes and adding, names onto them. But map out your ecosystem. And then visualize, maybe by drawing lines, how those elements interact and how they're contributing toward your strategic goals. See how the flow of your ecosystem works so that you can better understand it. You can identify where the weaknesses are or where you're performing poorly. And then identify and measure that strategic data. Whether you use the same metrics that I do or other metrics, figure out what your strategic data points are. Don't try to measure everything. Measure what's important and let those metrics lead you to the other information when necessary. So when you see problems, you dig into the operational data. And then lastly, that was my last point. Use that strategic data to guide you, because just don't get overwhelmed in all of the metrics that are out there that you could potentially track. So with that, Nicole, I'm going to turn things back over to you. If we have a minute or two for questions, I'm happy to take some.
I think, well, we had a couple, but I think one that might be still really relevant that people might want to hear about. Could you speak to the data that people talk a lot about that really isn't as critical as it's been made out to be?
Sure. A lot of the metrics that I see that people focus on are around the online marketing. So there's metrics around impressions or what's the cost per click or click-through rate. Even sometimes things like conversion rate for can be misleading. And that's one of the things we look at, but we also kind of keep in mind that the conversion rate can be manipulated based on the source of visitors. So let's talk about some of this. So cost per click, for example, it's going to cost you far less to get a click from someone on Facebook than it is from a well-targeted paid search ad. Paid search, we have some programs where the cost per click is $8 or $10. But those clicks tend to convert at a much higher rate, which is why we tend to look at things like what's our cost per lead and try to track that back into the respective marketing channels. So thinking about how much you're spending to get a click doesn't take into account the quality of those clicks and who those people are and what their intentions are. So that's a good example of that. There are certainly many, many, many others that you might look at.
Well, John, I think those are all of our questions for now, especially given the fact that it's 2:20. Is there anything you'd like to say in wrapping up?
I thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you found this useful. This is certainly something that's, as I said at the beginning, we're continuing to evolve our thinking around this subject. I'd be very curious to hear any thoughts that you guys have around the metaphor, the model of an ecosystem, the metrics that you're tracking. You're welcome to share that with us. Nicole, I think you're going to be recording this presentation, sending it out, and we've got a couple of upcoming sessions in the next couple of months, right?
We do, and I was just about to talk about that. Our next session will be April 16th. As you can see, we try and shoot for around the middle of the month, and that's going to be focused around 3 things on retargeting that you should be doing right now. And that one will have John again, but Jonna Wickstrom, who is our online marketing consultant, and that is her focus and passion, will also be joining us for that webinar. And then we'll have another one coming up in May, and I'm going to leave that as a teaser, but I promise to include it in the email. We will send email follow-ups with the link to register for the April info session, and as well as the link for this past one. And again, if anybody's going to be in Miami, John and I will both be in Miami. I encourage you to come talk with us. Please come to my presentation. I'll be presenting with Mercedes Cerati-Clark from the University of Houston, and we'll be talking about actually measurements and strategy when it comes to programs. And I believe that is all. As I said, if there was a question that we did not have the chance to answer, and I know for a fact there are a couple of questions that we didn't have the chance to answer, we will follow up with you within the next week or so. So thanks again. Have a fantastic day, and we look forward to talking with you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.